Welcome all to a presentation on character and characterization, where we're going to look at the kinds of characters that authors create in their works and the methods they use to convince us of, or to reveal to us the kind of characters they are, and in some cases to convince us that those characters could correspond to real life people. They convince us that they are individuals. Not all characters are like that. Some of them are just cartoon characters to just entertain us or help move the story along. We can divide characters into various types depending on either the role that they play in the story or the kind of person they represent. So even though many authors will try to create a sense in the reader that the characters could really be people, actual unique individuals, they still often will fall into one category or other. The first kind of category is simply that based on what their role is in the story. You're familiar with these terms, protagonist and antagonist. The protagonist being usually the main character, the character whose struggle forms the main focus of the plot. And in fact, the word protagonist comes from a word agon, meaning struggle. Here we know you know the word agony, which means suffering, but originally the word agon simply meant a struggle. So the protagonist is the person whose struggle for something forms the main focus of the plot. So it's usually the main character, not necessarily always. Sometimes the narrator of a work may be really the main character that we focus our attention on, but they may be talking about a protagonist who is trying to achieve something else. We also very commonly will use the term hero to refer to the protagonist, and that's because the term hero originally was generally used just for the protagonist of a work. But we also use the word hero to define someone who's larger than life and who stands as a good example to others, and that's definitely not always the case for protagonists in works of fiction or in movies. Very often the protagonist is, if anything, very, very far from a hero. The antagonist is the opponent, the force or person that the protagonist struggles against. Very often it is a person, or it can be embodied in, can be sort of focused on an individual or a few individuals. But sometimes the antagonist is just some sort of impersonal force. It might be society or the government or nature or fate. Also, it is worth noting that in longer works of fiction especially, the protagonist, there may be multiple protagonists and there may be multiple antagonists as well. I mentioned earlier that authors very often try to create a sense for the reader that the characters are real, that they could be real people with all their complexities and contradictions. And we call those kinds of characters round characters. You can look at them from different angles and they look differently. They look different according to what angle you're looking at. So we use the word round to define characters who have layers to themselves or different angles, which make them seem more complex and therefore more like real people rather than cartoon figures. Those are contrasted with flat characters who are like cartoon figures. They don't really have multiple dimensions. They're defined mostly just by one or two basic traits. It doesn't mean, by the way, that the author lacked skill if they resorted to using flat characters. Flat characters can be really useful for helping to advance the plot along. We don't need to know every side, every angle of every character for them to have an important function in the plot. And very often flat characters can be used for entertainment. If we only know, especially if they're comic characters, we only know their funniest trait or their weirdest trait. It's a way to keep us entertained with them whenever they appear in the story. Flat characters are often stock characters. That is, they kind of overlap, although you may have round characters that are stock characters as well. Stock character is a term for a character that's of a type that you already recognize. The kind of character that you've seen other versions of in other stories. So it's like there's a whole stock of them. So that would include things that you can define, kind of characters that you can define with just a phrase. The evil genius, the awkward nerd, and so on. Those of you who know who this character is from The Hunger Games might know that she turns out to be not quite as much of an airhead or as shallow as she appears to be, but she's still instantly recognizable as a kind of character type. I mentioned that that character does change. Our perception of her changes over the course of the story, which makes her the opposite of this kind of character. Another way we categorize characters are whether or not they change significantly, usually on the inside, in terms of their feelings, their attitudes, their values, whether they change over the course of the story or if they stay the same. If they stay the same, they are pretty much the same person at the end of the story as they were at the beginning. We call them static. Static characters do not undergo any significant change. They're pretty much the same at the end as they were at the beginning. By the way, if you're wondering what this has to do with, say, static electricity or static interference, static comes from the same word as statue, which means something that stays in place. So static electricity is electricity that doesn't run through a current, but that stands on the surface of things. And the reason why we call that sort of annoying interference noise in audio static is because if the electricity clings to the wires that are transmitting sound, it'll create that interference, and that just is called static shorthand. But what it means for characters just means they don't change. Like Katniss's mother, who is pretty much the same person throughout. Doesn't, by the way, make her a flat character. She's just not significantly different. Whereas a dynamic character is one who does change importantly, who may switch sides, for example, over the course of the story. Dynamic is related to words like dynamite and dynamo, which have to do with energy and the release of energy, and dynamic characters are called that because something happens to make them change their condition, their state, like dynamite changes dramatically when it explodes. Again, the changes that a dynamic character undergoes aren't necessarily just, say, from poor to rich or from young to old. It usually, the term applies to the changes that go on within them. You could have a person go from very young to very old without really changing their opinions or their attitudes about anything. In which case, well, their bodies have gotten old, but their minds have stayed pretty much static the whole time. We know those things about characters, whether they're dynamic or static, round or flat, because of the techniques authors use to create a sense for us of what those characters are. And we call that use of technique characterization, how the author creates for us a sense of who the characters are. And there is a variety of methods that authors use. We can subdivide them broadly into direct characterization and indirect. Direct characterization is simply when the author or the narrator, the author through the narrator, simply tells the reader what kind of person that character is. This quote from The Hunger Games, for example, Katniss, the narrator, directly tells us what to think of the character, what everybody else thinks about him, and pretty much sums up who this character is, what he's like at the point when he's introduced in the story. So it can be the narrator directly if it's a third-person narrator, or which means the author is sort of describing that character for us, or it could be a narrating character if the character isn't the narrator of the whole novel or story. More often, authors will use indirect characterization to reveal the character's traits, their personalities, by letting the characters show us who they are, what they're like, through various means, through, as we'll see, mostly they can be categorized into 5 different methods. Here, for example, when Katniss describes what she did, we know that she is selfless and heroic and self-sacrificing. She doesn't need to say, I sacrificed myself, or I was willing to, I bravely and selflessly put myself forward. She just says, this is what I did. And we infer, by reading this, what kind of a person she must be to be able to do that. So that would be indirect characterization through action, but that's only one of the 5 main indirect methods of characterization, which can be abbreviated with the letters L-E-A-S-T. Let's go through those in order. L stands for looks, which makes sense for us to start with the most superficial, the most outward one, how a character looks. according to how the narrator describes her or him, or how they appear on screen or on stage the first time we see them. Sometimes their facial expressions, the way their bodies move, will reveal something about what they're thinking. And also, sometimes, how they choose to present themselves, how they dress, how they do their hair, how they choose to stand, indicates what's important to them, how they want other people to perceive them. So even though we all know people very often are different on the inside from what they look like on the outside, if a character chooses to make herself look like this, that usually tells us something about what matters to them. So while looks can be deceiving, authors also know how to use outward looks to be revealing. E, in the least abbreviation, stands for the effect or effects that characters have on other people. How do other people feel about that person? How do other people behave around them? Do they follow that character when that character tries to lead them? So it involves their effects on how people feel about them, what other people say about them. If a character is perceived, is depicted rather, is described as being very popular with everybody because he's so kind or brave or whatever, well, that reveals to us why they like that character. A, as I mentioned, stands for actions. How do the actions the characters perform reveal something about their values, their inner lives, their feelings? And that would include how do they react to what other characters do. S stands for speech. Often the very most direct way for a character to reveal what he or she is thinking, although, of course, we all know that plenty of characters don't speak everything that's in their minds. They may lie, they may withhold the entire truth about themselves. And so very often, not only what they say, but how they say it can be very revealing. Their tone, if they're evasive, if they avoid saying certain things when they're asked questions, their word choice reveals something about either what they want other people to think about them or just who they are if they aren't thinking carefully about what they say. And then finally, the character's inner thoughts. T stands for the thoughts of the characters. Now, if it's a first-person narration, we will often get the character's inner thoughts directly. Katniss, when she narrates the Hunger Games novels, will tell the reader what she was thinking. But we can also sometimes get a sense of how the characters are thinking through their behaviors, and that may reveal, again, layers to them. If a character acts in a way that suggests they're troubled, it reveals that they're not comfortable with what they're doing or that they're undergoing a change. And so we may get their thoughts in addition to their actions or through their actions, and the kinds of thoughts that they're having also tell us whether they're good people or bad people, or capable of growth or static characters. So here are all 5 of those methods together. We can learn about the characters through their looks, through their effects on others, through the actions they undertake, through their speech, how they talk, and through their inner thoughts, either revealed directly through the narration or through other means. So that's it for character and characterization. Thank you for watching our presentation on it. Till next